He slammed his glass on the counter so hard that the bartender flinched, the sharp clink echoing through the dimly lit bar like a gunshot. The sound sliced through the low hum of conversation, silencing laughter and breaking the rhythm of the jukebox humming an old country tune in the corner. The scent of whiskey, sweat, and fried food hung heavy in the air, wrapping around the flickering neon lights that buzzed just above the liquor shelves. It was a Friday night, payday for most of the men in uniform, and this place, the Iron Compass, was their unofficial hangout. Everyone who came here knew their place. Everyone, that is, except the woman sitting quietly at the end of the bar. Captain Brad Henson sat in his usual booth, surrounded by his men. His uniform jacket was draped carelessly over the seat beside him, medals gleaming faintly in the dim light, reminders of the man who'd led dozens of operations across the world. He was the kind of man who carried authority in every gesture, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp as a blade, and the kind of soldier who believed he'd seen everything. But arrogance had become his armor, and tonight, he wore it proudly. When his gaze landed on the woman, something in him bristled. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to blend in or seek attention. She just sat there, calm, composed, sipping from a glass of water, wearing a simple brown jacket with no visible name tag or rank. It wasn't her presence that bothered him. It was her stillness. That quiet kind of confidence that didn't need to prove anything. Brad hated that kind of silence, the kind that made his own voice sound too loud. "You call yourself a soldier," he suddenly called out, his tone half mocking, half testing. Heads turned instantly. The other SEALs paused mid-drink, eyes darting between their captain and the woman. She didn't respond. Didn't even glance his way. Brad smirked, leaning back in his seat. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," he said louder, tapping his knuckles against the table. "You look like you wandered into the wrong bar. This place is for real fighters." A few chuckles rippled through the group, the kind that came from people too afraid to challenge him but too eager to join his laughter. The bartender froze, trying to decide whether to step in, but he'd seen this dynamic before. Soldiers teasing civilians, testing boundaries. But something about the woman was different. She didn't look frightened or defensive. She didn't shrink away. She just took another slow sip of her drink, eyes still on the glass, like she hadn't even heard him. Her silence only made Brad more irritated. "What's the matter?" he taunted, standing now, his boots thudding against the old wooden floor. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just pretending to be one of us." He motioned to the insignia on his shirt, the trident that marked him as a Navy SEAL. "This," he said, tapping it, "is earned. Not worn for decoration." She finally looked up then. Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken, and far older than her face suggested. Something in that look made a few men glance away, uneasy. She didn't glare or frown, she just studied him for a moment, as if measuring his worth. Then she said softly, "You seem very proud of your uniform, Captain." Her voice was steady, low, almost melodic. The calm tone only added fuel to Brad's anger. "You're damn right I am," he snapped. "I've bled for it. I've buried men for it. You think you can sit here and," she interrupted gently, still not raising her voice. "Then you should know better than to underestimate those who've done the same." The room grew even quieter. Brad's smirk faltered, replaced by confusion. "You?" he said incredulously, trying to laugh it off. "You're telling me you're military?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to her drink, that same soft composure never leaving her face. Brad took a step closer, standing right beside her now. "Come on, sweetheart. What's your name?" he asked, his tone turning sharp again. She looked at him, and for the first time, a hint of a smile appeared on her lips. "Not my name," she said. "My call sign." That word, call sign, made the air shift. The laughter that had been bubbling in the corner died completely. A few of the men exchanged glances. Call signs weren't something civilians knew about. They were sacred identifiers, reserved for those who'd flown missions, fought behind enemy lines, or led operations so classified that names were replaced with code words. Brad froze for a second, unsure if she was mocking him or serious. "Oh, you've got a call sign," he said finally, forcing a grin. "Well, let's hear it then. I could use a good laugh." But she didn't answer. Instead, she set her glass down gently on the counter, the sound of it meeting wood echoing louder than his taunt. She stood slowly, straightening her jacket, revealing a faint patch on her shoulder, faded, worn, but unmistakable to anyone who'd served long enough. Brad's grin vanished. He recognized the emblem immediately, an elite Air Division insignia. She took a small step forward, looking up at him. "You wanted my call sign, Captain," she said quietly, her voice now carrying a weight that filled the entire room. "It's Falcon." The moment that name left her lips, everything stopped. The bartender froze mid-pour. One of the younger SEALs at Brad's table whispered, "Wait, the Falcon?" Brad's heart sank. The legends flooded back, the pilot who had flown through enemy fire to save a downed SEAL team. The woman who had disobeyed direct orders just to bring her soldiers home. The hero whose story was told in training camps across the country. Brad's mouth went dry as he realized who was standing before him, and what he'd just done. The bar fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that made even the ice in glasses seem louder. A few heads turned toward the commotion, but no one spoke. The air was thick, a mix of sweat, whiskey, and tension. Captain Brad Henson stood tall, his broad frame blocking the light from the hanging neon sign above him. He smirked, half drunk, half arrogant, his uniform shirt open at the collar, dog tags glinting faintly under the dim light. To his men, he was a legend, a man who had led them through deserts and jungles, who had medals pinned to his chest and scars to prove every one of them. But tonight, inside this bar, Brad wasn't a hero. He was a man drunk on pride. The woman across from him sat perfectly still. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't trying to disappear. She simply existed in a calm that didn't fit the room. Her dark brown skin glowed softly under the yellow bar light, her simple jacket neatly zipped, her braids pulled back into a low bun beneath a faded scarf. She wasn't showing off rank, no badges, no stripes. Just peace. And that peace, that quiet confidence, was what made Brad's ego burn. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his grin widening as his friends chuckled behind him. "You don't belong here. This is where warriors come to drink, not where civilians play dress-up." His words hung in the air like poison. A few of his fellow SEALs exchanged glances, their laughter forced now, unsure if this was still funny. The woman still didn't respond. She placed her glass gently on the counter, her eyes focused not on him but on the water sliding down the outside of the glass. A droplet fell, landing with a small splash, the sound barely audible, yet somehow, it cut through the noise of the bar like thunder. Brad frowned, irritated by her silence. He wanted her to fight back, to get flustered, to prove his assumptions right. But her stillness unnerved him. He took another step closer, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "You got a name?" he pressed, his voice lower now, baiting her. "Or should I just call you Wannabe?" He chuckled, and his men followed, the laughter ringing hollow. The woman's fingers tapped once against the table, slow and deliberate. Then she looked up. Her eyes met his, calm, steady, and piercing. They weren't afraid, they weren't angry either. They simply saw him, in a way that stripped his bravado bare. For a fleeting second, he felt something he hadn't in years, small. She spoke at last, her tone soft yet carrying a weight that made every word land. "Call sign," she said quietly. "Not name." Brad blinked, caught off guard. The bar went dead silent. Even the old ceiling fan above seemed to pause mid-rotation. "What was that?" he asked, the smirk returning to his face, though weaker now. She repeated, slower this time, "Call sign." Her voice wasn't challenging, it was controlled, deliberate, and laced with authority. He frowned, pretending not to understand. "Oh, you've got a call sign now," he said with a dry laugh, turning to his team. "All right, sweetheart. Enlighten me. Let's hear it." His tone dripped with sarcasm, but something about her composure unsettled him. She didn't break eye contact. Didn't shift. Didn't smile. The bartender, wiping a glass nearby, stopped mid-motion, his instincts telling him something important was about to happen. The woman sat back, folding her hands neatly on the table. She studied him, not like an opponent, but like someone weighing a choice, whether to remind him of his place or let his arrogance crumble on its own. Her voice broke the silence once more. "Funny thing about call signs, Captain," she said evenly. "They're earned. Not given." The way she said Captain made him blink. It wasn't disrespectful, it was sharp, precise, like she knew exactly who he was and exactly how far he'd fallen from what the title should mean. "You're serious?" he asked, his smirk faltering just slightly. She tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his. "You asked for my name," she said softly, "but in my world, names don't mean much. What matters is what you've done when no one was watching." The words hit harder than he expected. His men shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging glances that said maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a game anymore. But Brad couldn't stop. Pride wouldn't let him. "So what's your call sign then?" he demanded, his tone louder now, forcing dominance back into his voice. "If you're gonna sit here pretending you've earned it, at least give us something to call you." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she sighed softly, like a teacher tired of explaining something obvious. "You wouldn't believe me," she murmured. Brad chuckled dryly. "Try me." The pause stretched. The air grew heavier. She rose slowly, her chair scraping the floor with a low groan. Though she was smaller in frame, her presence seemed to fill the room. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice calm but cold enough to cut through his laughter. Brad nodded, crossing his arms. "Yeah," he said. "Let's hear it. Entertain us." Her gaze flicked toward his men, then back to him. "Falcon," she said finally. Just one word, soft, but it landed like a thunderclap. Brad froze. The name echoed in his mind, sparking memories he didn't want to believe. The room, once filled with low murmurs and chuckles, fell dead silent. One of the seals at the back, the youngest of the group, went pale. "Wait," he whispered. "Falcon?" His voice trembled. "As in Commander Falcon?" Brad's smirk vanished completely. His blood ran cold. He'd heard that name before, everyone had. Falcon was the codename of a top military pilot, a ghost in the sky who had saved entire units during Black Ops missions. A legend whose missions were classified and whose identity was never revealed. Brad's jaw tightened as realization began to claw at him. He had just mocked a hero. And she was standing right in front of him. For a long, still moment, she didn't answer. The bar was so quiet you could hear the faint crackle of the old neon sign above the counter and the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. Every eye was on her, the mysterious woman who had just silenced a room full of decorated soldiers with nothing but her presence. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She simply stood, letting the weight of the moment build until even the air felt heavy. Then, she rose from her chair. Slowly, deliberately. Her movements were calm, practiced. The kind of calm that comes from a life lived under pressure, where panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. She was shorter than Brad by at least a head, but as soon as she stood, the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. She didn't look like someone intimidated. She looked like someone who had seen real fear, and learned to control it. "You really want to know?" she asked at last. Her voice wasn't loud, yet somehow, it carried through every corner of the room. It was steady and sure, the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. Brad, still clutching his drink, let out a short laugh, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Sure," he said, leaning back, his smirk returning. "Let's hear it." The woman's eyes flicked over the crowd. The soldiers, the bartenders, even the few civilians who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, all of them were silent now, waiting. She scanned the room slowly, like she was taking a mental roll call, like she'd been trained to read a room before stepping into danger. Then her gaze landed back on Brad. "Falcon," she said. Just one word. Soft. Controlled. But it hit the room like an explosion. For a second, nobody moved. The word seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls and into the silence that followed. The bartender froze mid-pour, a thin stream of whiskey spilling over the edge of a glass and dripping onto the counter. One of the seals at Brad's table blinked hard, as if he hadn't heard her right. "Wait," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Falcon? As in Commander Falcon?" Brad's grin faltered. The name hung in his mind like a ghost from an old mission report. He'd heard it countless times, always in awe, always in stories that sounded too wild to be true. Falcon wasn't just a name. It was a legend. The SEALs exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, a stocky man with a scar across his jaw, spoke up hesitantly. "Falcon's the one who saved Team Bravo in Helmand," he said. "Flew through a sandstorm at night, no radar, no comms. Everyone thought that op was lost." Another nodded. "Not just that," he added quietly. "Falcon's the one who pulled out Commander Ruiz's unit in Fallujah. They said the chopper came in under enemy fire, engines failing, still got everyone out." Each story added another layer to the silence that had fallen over the bar. You could see it now, recognition spreading like wildfire through the crowd. Everyone who had worn a uniform, everyone who had served in combat, knew the name Falcon. She wasn't just a pilot. She was the pilot. The one who broke every rule, defied every order, and somehow always brought her people home. Brad's smirk had completely vanished. His drink hung loosely in his hand, forgotten. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you..." She didn't let him finish. "Yes," she said simply. "That was me." Her tone wasn't boastful. There was no pride in it, just truth. A quiet confirmation of something far greater than anything Brad could ever understand. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal coin, the kind issued to special operatives who completed classified missions. She placed it on the table between them. The coin gleamed faintly under the yellow light, stamped with the insignia of a falcon in flight and a line of engraved numbers that only someone from the inside would recognize. One of Brad's men let out a low whistle. Another muttered a curse under his breath. They had heard rumors that Falcon was a ghost, someone who existed only in whispers and reports stamped, top secret. To see proof, right here, was like seeing a myth come to life. Brad swallowed hard. His confidence cracked, his bravado fading fast. You were Air Force?" he asked, though the question sounded ridiculous now. "Joint Special Operations Command," she replied. "Task Force 0. And before you ask, yes, I worked with your team. Operation Nightfire. You were on the extraction list." The words hit him like a punch. His eyes widened. He remembered that mission, the one where they were pinned down for hours, surrounded, running out of ammunition, with no hope of air support. Then, out of nowhere, a chopper had appeared, low and fast, cutting through a storm that should have grounded every aircraft in the region. He'd never known who flew it. Until now. Brad lowered his gaze, shame burning in his chest. "That was, you?" he said quietly. She nodded once. "You were lucky that night," she said. "But not because you were brave. Because someone broke the rules to save you." For a long time, no one spoke. The SEALs who had laughed earlier now stared at the floor, their pride shrinking under the weight of respect. The bartender set the whiskey bottle down gently, his hands trembling slightly. Brad took a slow breath, his arrogance replaced by something else, humility. He straightened, set his glass down, and gave a short, respectful nod. "Commander," he said softly, his voice stripped of mockery. She didn't gloat. Didn't smirk. She simply nodded back. "Captain." Then she turned, leaving a stunned silence behind her, the kind of silence only legends leave in their wake. Brad's voice caught in his throat. "That's not, he couldn't even form the words. His mind was racing, scrambling for a version of this reality where he wasn't standing there, looking like a fool in front of his own men. The bar that had once felt like his stage suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. The woman across from him, calm, unshaken, tilted her head slightly, studying him with eyes that saw straight through ego and bravado. "You were on that team, weren't you?" she asked quietly. "Alpha 9. Afghanistan. 2020. Brad blinked, the name hitting him like a thunderclap. He hadn't heard those words out loud in years. His hand tightened around his glass as memories came flooding back, the desert night, the gunfire echoing through the valley, the deafening silence after the comms went dead. He swallowed hard, but she wasn't finished. "You lost comms," she continued. "Extraction failed. I got the call at 0300 hours. The room went utterly still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. Brad's throat felt dry, his heart pounding against his ribs. The other SEALs looked between them, confusion turning to disbelief, and then, slowly, to recognition. They remembered that mission too. Everyone in Special Ops circles did. Alpha 9 was the team that wasn't supposed to make it home. The weather was impossible, enemy fire everywhere, the extraction plan cancelled because no pilot was crazy enough to attempt it. But someone had. Brad remembered the voice over the static-filled radio, calm, steady, female. He'd assumed it was a ground operator relaying orders. He'd never known who it belonged to. Until now. He tried to laugh it off, to claw his way back into control of the room. "You're telling me you were." She cut him off gently, her tone soft but final. "I'm not telling you anything, Captain," she said. "I don't need to." That quiet confidence, not defensive, not angry, just factual, crushed whatever pride Brad had left. It wasn't a boast. It was a reminder. A woman like her didn't need to prove herself to men like him. Her record, her courage, her legacy had already done that, long before this night. Brad opened his mouth, but no words came. He stood there, motionless, feeling the sting of every time he'd underestimated someone, every careless remark, every smirk, every sweetheart that had ever left his lips. He wasn't facing just another soldier now. He was standing before the ghost of his own arrogance. The woman, Commander Falcon, began gathering her things. She moved with quiet precision, folding her jacket over her arm, her dog tags glinting faintly in the bar's dim light. The room watched her in reverent silence. Even the bartender, who had seen more bar fights than birthdays, just stood still, eyes wide, not daring to speak. Brad's hand trembled slightly around his glass. He could feel his team's eyes on him, men who had followed him for years, now seeing him in a way they never had before. He wasn't the toughest man in the room anymore. He wasn't even close. The woman reached into her pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the counter. "For the trouble," she said softly, nodding politely to the bartender. Her voice carried no bitterness, no triumph. Just calm dignity, the kind that comes from knowing who you are, even when others try to diminish it. The bartender nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible. As she turned to leave, one of the younger SEALs, the same one who had laughed earlier, stood abruptly, his expression filled with something between awe and shame. "Commander," he said quietly, almost a whisper. She paused, glanced back at him, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Take care of your team," she said simply. "That's all that matters." Brad stood frozen, his jaw clenched, unable to meet her eyes. He wanted to say something, an apology, maybe, or a thank you, but the words refused to come. His pride wouldn't let him speak, yet his silence felt heavier than any admission he could have made. She walked toward the door, her steps unhurried. Each one echoed softly against the floorboards, a rhythmic reminder of who she was, someone who had risked everything for men who didn't even know her name. The door opened, letting in a brief rush of cool night air that cut through the heavy stillness of the room. For a second, she stopped at the threshold and looked back, not at Brad, but at the room itself, filled with men who were finally learning what real strength looked like. "Good night, gentlemen," she said quietly. Then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a silence that no one dared to break. For a long time, nobody moved. The bartender slowly started wiping the counter again, but even his hands were shaking. One of the SEALs exhaled a shaky breath. "Holy hell," he murmured. That was her. Brad didn't answer. He just stared at the door, his reflection in the half-empty glass beside him, a proud man stripped down to humility. The name Falcon echoed in his head like a prayer and a warning all at once. He finally set his drink down, the sound of glass on wood oddly gentle this time. "She flew through a sandstorm for us," he muttered under his breath. "And I threw a drink at her." No one replied. They didn't have to. The silence said it all. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a helicopter cut through the night, like an echo from a story that would never fade. As she turned to leave, Brad found his voice again, though it trembled, strangled by regret. "Ma'am," he said, the word so soft it was almost lost in the stillness. She stopped mid-step, her hand brushing the edge of the door. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye turned toward him, the once cocky SEAL captain now standing awkwardly, shoulders heavy, voice cracking. For the first time that night, the arrogance was gone. She looked back over her shoulder, her expression calm, unreadable. Her eyes met his, not in anger, not even disappointment, but with something deeper. It was the look of someone who had seen men like him all her life. Proud. Loud. Certain of their strength. Until the world reminded them that strength had many forms. He swallowed hard, words tumbling out clumsily. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was low, full of something raw, part apology, part confession. The bar, once a blur of laughter and noise, was now a silent theater. The jukebox's hum, the clinking of glasses, even the soft whir of the ceiling fan had faded into nothing. She studied him for a long, quiet moment. Then a small, knowing smile curved her lips. "You never asked," she said gently. The sentence landed heavier than any insult could have. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even sharp. It was simply true. And in that truth, Brad felt the full weight of what he'd done, not just tonight, but every night he dismissed someone without a second thought. The words echoed in his mind like a verdict, "You never asked." Then she pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. A rush of cool air swept through the bar, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and jet fuel, something that felt alive, untamed. The door closed softly behind her with a quiet click that seemed to mark the end of something much larger than a barroom encounter. For a long while, no one moved. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The men who had laughed earlier now sat frozen, eyes fixed on the empty doorway. The bartender slowly polished the same glass over and over, pretending not to watch, but everyone knew he was. The music hadn't resumed. The lights seemed dimmer somehow. The warmth that had filled the room before, the easy laughter, the smug camaraderie, was gone. What remained was something raw and real: shame. Reflection. Respect. Brad stood there, every second dragging on like an eternity. His drink was still in his hand, but the ice had melted into a weak swirl of amber water. He didn't take another sip. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, his chest heavier than his armor ever had. He sat down slowly, elbows on the table, staring into the glass as if it could give him an answer. One of his men, the youngest, the one who had laughed the loudest, shifted awkwardly in his seat. "You really messed up, sir," he muttered under his breath. The words weren't said with judgment, but they hit hard anyway. Brad didn't look up. He just nodded slightly, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," he said. "I know." The team exchanged glances, unsure of what to say or do. They had seen their captain lead raids, survive ambushes, and stare death in the face without blinking. But they had never seen him look small. Tonight, he did. Not because anyone had stripped his power away, but because a woman had reminded him what true strength looked like. Minutes passed. The bartender finally broke the silence, speaking softly as he wiped the counter. "She saved your lives, didn't she?" Brad blinked, the question cutting through his fog of guilt. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "She did." "Then I'd say she earned her drink," the bartender said, setting a clean glass back on the shelf. That drew a faint, humorless smile from Brad. He finally looked toward the door again, where the last echo of her footsteps had vanished. He pictured her walking out into the night, unbothered, unstoppable, carrying herself with the same grace she had when she'd faced a room full of men who doubted her. He thought about her words again. "You never asked." That single sentence replayed in his head, looping endlessly, reshaping something inside him. All his years in the field, all his medals, all his command, none of it had taught him that lesson. He had built his life around orders, action, authority. But tonight, a quiet woman had reminded him that leadership wasn't just about commanding respect. It was about giving it. Finally, he stood, reached into his wallet, and placed a few folded bills next to her empty glass. "For the next time she comes back," he told the bartender softly. The bartender nodded, saying nothing. Brad turned to his team. "Let's go," he said, his tone no longer sharp or commanding. Just tired. Reflective. Different. As they filed out of the bar, the youngest SEAL lingered a moment longer, glancing at the door. "Do you think we'll see her again?" he asked quietly. Brad paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Maybe not," he said. "But if we do, we'll make sure we're the ones standing up first." Outside, the night air hit him like a baptism, cool, clear, cleansing. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly over the ocean, the same ocean that had once separated him from death until a pilot named Falcon broke every rule to bring him home. He looked up at the dark sky, the stars faint behind the clouds. "You never asked," he whispered again, this time to himself, not as regret, but as a vow. Then he walked into the night, leaving the bar, and the man he had been, behind. Outside, the wind carried the faint, distant sound of jets roaring over the coast, slicing cleanly through the night sky like echoes from another world. Their engines hummed low and steady, fading in and out over the sound of the ocean waves crashing somewhere beyond the harbor. Brad sat by the window of the bar, staring out into the darkness, his reflection ghosted in the glass, a man who suddenly looked older, smaller, quieter. Those jets reminded him of the woman who had just walked out. Falcon. The name alone had been enough to silence an entire room of hardened soldiers. He leaned back in his chair, letting the sound of the night seep into him. For years, that name had floated through the ranks like a myth, whispered in mess halls, spoken with reverence in the field. Falcon. The pilot who had done what no one else dared. The one who had defied orders, outflown storms, and pulled off rescues that should have been impossible. He remembered the first time he'd heard the story, back when he was still a lieutenant. A mission gone wrong in the Afghan desert. A team stranded behind enemy lines. Extraction cancelled because the weather was too violent, visibility zero, the area too hot. Command had called it a lost cause. But one pilot had said no. He remembered that part vividly now, sitting in a tent, hearing an older commander slam his hand on the table and say, if it wasn't for Falcon, those boys would still be ghosts out there. Brad had lifted his glass that night, toasting a name he didn't know, never imagining it belonged to someone who would one day sit quietly across from him, sipping water in a bar full of men who thought themselves brave. He exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. How many times had he cheered stories like that without ever thinking about the person behind them? He'd imagined someone larger than life, maybe a grizzled war hero, a man with scars and medals. He'd never imagined her. A woman. Calm. Poised. Gentle. Her strength didn't come from a uniform or a raised voice, it came from the kind of stillness that made noise feel small. Brad's gaze drifted back toward the empty table where she had sat. Her glass still had a thin ring of water around it, the condensation slowly drying in the warm air. It was such a small, ordinary thing, yet it carried more weight than any of his medals. That glass had sat between two versions of himself, the man who mocked without thought and the man who now understood silence for what it truly was, power, discipline, grace. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the neon bar sign. He watched the letters flicker, the Harbor House, open late. The same place he'd always come after missions, to brag, to drink, to be the loudest voice in the room. But tonight, he didn't feel like talking. He didn't even want another drink. His hands, usually restless, just sat there, fingers tracing the wet ring on the table like it might hold answers. He could still hear her voice in his head. You never asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was truth, pure and simple. She'd lived a life of service while men like him assumed their courage was unique. How many times had he looked past someone because of how they appeared? How many soldiers, pilots, medics had gone unseen because their strength wasn't wrapped in bravado? Brad's chest tightened, a strange mix of regret and admiration flooding through him. He realized this wasn't shame anymore, not really. It was something quieter, deeper. Respect. The kind that stays, that changes you. He thought of that mission again, Alpha 9, the one she had saved. The night the desert sky had burned red, the air choked with sand and fear. He remembered the radio going dead, the panic in his squad's eyes, the sinking certainty that they weren't going home. Then, a faint voice had broken through the static, Alpha 9, this is Falcon. Hold tight. He hadn't even believed it at first. The comms officer had said extraction was impossible. But then, through the chaos, came the sound of rotor blades. And against all odds, she'd arrived. He could still see it in his mind, the chopper breaking through the storm, lightning flashing against its frame, the wind so fierce it should have ripped it apart. She'd hovered long enough for every man to get aboard, flying them through the worst storm of the year, instruments failing, engines choking on dust. And she'd done it alone. No escort, no backup. He'd been one of the last men to step off that helicopter. He remembered turning back to look at the pilot's seat, wanting to say something, to see the face of the person who'd saved them all. But she'd already been turning away, ready to head back into the storm for another pickup. He'd never known her name. Until tonight. Brad swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. The world outside the window blurred for a moment, the reflection of the jets overhead shimmering in the glass. Somewhere up there, he imagined her, Falcon, flying again, chasing the edge of the sky where fear couldn't reach her. He straightened in his seat, finally lifting his drink, not to drown the night away, but to honor it. "To you," he said softly. "To Falcon." The bartender, polishing a glass nearby, looked up. "She's something, huh?" he said quietly. Brad nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond the glass. "No," he said, his voice low but certain. "She's everything." The wind howled once more, and as the sound of jets faded into the distance, Brad felt something shift inside him, the smallest flicker of change, steady and unstoppable. Respect had taken root where arrogance once lived, and he knew, deep down, that he'd never hear the name Falcon the same way again. When Brad finally stepped outside, the air hit him like a slap, cold, sharp, and honest. It was the kind of night that stripped away pretenses. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the yellow light from a single flickering lamp stretching long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a moment, Brad stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at his breath-forming clouds in the air. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses from inside the bar, all of it felt miles away, like it belonged to another life. He saw her then. Across the lot, near the far end where the light didn't quite reach, she was unlocking the door of an old, beat-up truck. The kind of vehicle you drive if you didn't care what people thought, sturdy, practical, worn but reliable. Her figure was silhouetted against the faint glow of the bar sign, jacket collar turned up against the chill. Even from where he stood, there was a stillness about her, not hesitation, not sadness, but peace. For a second, Brad felt something stir in his chest. The urge to call out, to say something, anything. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, that he hadn't known, that he'd been blind. Maybe he'd tell her how much he respected her now, how her story had changed him. But the words jammed in his throat, heavy and clumsy. What could he possibly say that would make any of it right? He took a tentative step forward, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. She turned then, just as she was about to open the driver's door. Their eyes met across the lot, not for long, maybe 2 seconds at most, but it was enough. The look she gave him wasn't anger, nor was it pity. It was calm, resolute. A silent acknowledgement of something deeper than words, that she had already moved past it. That she didn't need his apology to find peace. Then she nodded. Just once. A small, almost imperceptible gesture that hit harder than anything she could have said aloud. It could have meant "I forgive you." It could have meant "we're done here." Brad couldn't tell. But in that simple motion, he felt the finality of the night settle in his bones. She climbed into the truck, the door creaking slightly before it shut with a solid thud. The engine coughed to life, sputtering for a second before steadying into a low hum. The headlights cut through the darkness, and as she pulled away, Brad's reflection shimmered briefly in the chrome before disappearing. The red glow of her tail lights drifted farther and farther into the night until they were swallowed by the road and the darkness beyond. Brad stood there for a long time, watching the empty stretch of highway where she'd gone. The wind tugged at his jacket, carrying the faint smell of oil and sea salt from the docks nearby. He thought about everything that had happened inside the bar, the laughter that had died on their lips, the weight that had filled the room when she spoke her name, the realization that every one of them had been sitting in the presence of someone who had done more for her country than any of them ever would. He looked down at his hands. Rough, scarred, the hands of a soldier, hands that had carried weapons, signed reports, shaken the hands of generals. Hands that had once saluted men like her, though he hadn't known it at the time. Now those same hands felt small, fragile even. The kind of hands that could hurt with words as easily as they could fight wars. Behind him, the bar door creaked open. "Captain, you coming?" one of his men called. The voice was hesitant, uncertain, like they all knew something had shifted tonight, something they couldn't quite name. Brad didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the empty road, the silence stretching between his heartbeat and the wind. Finally, he murmured, "Yeah." In a minute. His voice sounded different, stripped of the arrogance it once carried. The door swung shut again, leaving him alone in the quiet. The neon sign above flickered once more before steadying into a faint hum. In that silence, with only the hum of electricity and the whisper of wind around him, one truth settled heavy in his mind: real strength never needs to shout. He thought about her again, how she hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't defended herself, hadn't listed her accomplishments. She had let the truth speak for itself. That was the kind of strength he'd never understood before tonight. The kind that didn't come from rank or recognition, but from character. For years, Brad had lived believing strength meant dominance. The louder you were, the tougher you looked, the more respect you earned. But now, standing alone under that flickering light, he realized how wrong he'd been. Strength wasn't loud. It wasn't pride. It was the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He looked once more down the road, imagining her truck disappearing into the horizon, back to whatever simple life she lived. No medals, no applause, no grand speeches. Just quiet dignity. Brad drew in a long, steady breath and exhaled into the cold night air. "Thank you," he whispered, though she was far out of earshot. The words disappeared into the wind, but somehow, he felt lighter saying them. Then, squaring his shoulders, he turned back toward the bar, toward his men, his command, and the lessons he still had to unlearn. And as he reached for the door, the final thought came to him clear and unshakable: real heroes don't wait for the world to notice them. They just keep driving into the dark, doing what's right, whether anyone's watching.